President Trump says these new tariffs will help American farmers and ranchers. But on the ground, from California to Iowa, farmers and economists are telling a very different story. They say this could hurt not just the people who grow America's food, but everyone who buys it. What's unfolding right now isn't just about tariffs, soybeans, or one trade dispute. It's about how global supply chains are being rewritten and how that shift could permanently change who holds power in the world economy. It started with soybeans. When China suddenly canceled over $1 billion worth of U.S. soybean orders, the expectation was chaos, shortages, rising prices, and panic in commodity markets. But that's not what happened. Within days, the gap was filled. Brazil stepped in. Global markets adjusted. Prices stabilized. And in that quiet, efficient transition, something profound was revealed. The world no longer depends on any single supplier, not even the United States. In Iowa and Illinois, soybean inventories shot up 13%. Prices dropped more than 8%. Within a week, farmers had lost roughly $470 million in value. As one producer put it, it's like being cut off mid-season with no backup plan. The bigger picture, tariffs and timing. This didn't happen in isolation. The cancellations came less than 48 hours after the U.S. announced new tariffs on roughly $90 billion worth of Chinese imports. China never officially said it was retaliation, but the timing told its own story. And economists began warning, this wasn't a one-time trade jab. It could mark the beginning of a permanent realignment in global agriculture, one that reduces China's reliance on American exports altogether. Here's what's crucial to understand. This didn't happen overnight. Between 2020 and 2024, Brazil expanded its soybean production by more than 20%, fueled by over $11 billion in infrastructure investments, much of it financed directly or indirectly by Chinese banks. New rail lines and ports drastically cut shipping times and costs. By 2025, China was sourcing 70% of its soybean needs from Brazil, up from less than half just 5 years earlier. And China wasn't stopping there. It was building trade partnerships across the global south, signing long-term contracts with Argentina, Russia, and Pakistan, securing more than 70% of its total grain and oilseed imports from non-US suppliers. Even when Brazil's harvest wasn't fully ready, China was willing to pay up to $22 more per ton than the US rate, a clear sign that cost was no longer the priority. Stability was. A strategic pivot in motion. On paper, this looked like a supply shift. In reality, it was a strategy decades in the making. For years, China has invested billions in Latin American logistics, railways, ports, grain terminals, all to reduce future supply risks. By 2024, nearly two-thirds of China's soybean imports passed through trade routes in which China had direct ownership or influence. This is what economists call infrastructure diplomacy, using investments in logistics to secure long-term trade security and political alignment. At the same time, U.S. agricultural exports to China dropped by 26% in early 2025, cutting trade flows by over $3.2 billion in just one quarter. Meanwhile, China's new deals with Brazil included both soybeans and corn, up to 9 million tons annually, worth more than $2.6 billion. Even U.S. corn exports to China fell nearly 30% in a single quarter. A quiet trade revolution. The lesson here goes beyond crops. What happened with soybeans was a case study in how global trade can now reconfigure itself, fast. A few decades ago, canceling that many contracts would have triggered global panic. Today, it simply redirects. That's because the architecture of global trade is changing. Countries are no longer bound by singular dependencies. Instead, they're building webs of partnerships, multi-sourced, diversified, and digitally managed. And in this new world, infrastructure, logistics, and long-term planning matter more than tariffs or price. Why it matters for the U.S. For the United States, this shift is both a warning and an opportunity. The warning is simple: old assumptions no longer hold. The U.S. can't rely on being the default exporter forever. Global buyers now have options, and they're exercising them. But the opportunity lies in adaptation. If the US modernizes its ports, invests in digital logistics, strengthens regional trade agreements like USMCA, and builds new ties with Africa and Southeast Asia, it can still remain a global leader. That leadership, however, will come not from dominance, but from reliability. Because in a world of volatile supply chains, trust is the new currency. The rise of smarter trade. The next era of global commerce isn't about who sells the most, it's about who plans the best. Countries like China are proving that with the right infrastructure, financing, and partnerships, they can redirect billion-dollar industries without disruption. And as trade becomes increasingly digital, powered by blockchain tracking, AI forecasting, and smart contracts, control over logistics and data will matter just as much as control over goods. Nations that master those systems will shape the rules of global trade itself. For the US, catching up means integrating agriculture and manufacturing into these emerging platforms, ensuring American products aren't just competitive, but connected to the networks that will define the next generation of trade. Adapting for the future. Policy responses focused on tariffs and subsidies can only go so far. They offer short-term relief, not long-term strength. Real resilience will come from diversification, both in what America sells and where it sells it. That means investing in advanced agricultural research, sustainable farming, and infrastructure modernization. It also means deepening cooperation with countries that are still looking for dependable trade partners in Latin America, Africa, and the Indo-Pacific. A turning point, not a decline. The soybean story isn't a sign of decline. It's a turning point, a moment that shows just how quickly global systems can evolve when backed by planning, technology, and intent. The world isn't abandoning trade, it's making trade smarter. And nations that adapt to that new reality will lead the next chapter. For the US, that means shifting from reactive policy to proactive strategy. From protectionism to partnership. From short-term fixes to long-term vision. Because the next trade battles won't be fought with tariffs, they'll be fought with infrastructure, innovation, and trust. The soybean pivot was never just about soybeans. It was about showing the world that in the modern era, economic influence isn't about dominance, it's about dependability. And the countries that invest early, plan deeply, and build relationships based on trust will shape the systems that define global trade for decades to come. So as tariffs rise and markets shift, the real question isn't who wins the next round, it's who's building for the long game. If the US embraces that future, soybeans won't be remembered as a loss, but as the moment America decided to compete smarter. Before you go, hit like and subscribe. It helps the channel reach more people. And let me know in the comments, do you think the US can still lead in this new era of trade?